En général, que moi, du coup, comme j'ai pas de diapo à changer, je vais rester. J'ai pas de diapo à changer, donc je vais rester là. On va passer derrière. Toi, tu auras des diapos à changer, tu pourras être là. Moi, je reste là.
Moi, si ça vous va, je me mets là parce que le présentateur en mode moi. J'aime pas les feuilles.
Ouais, c'est ce qu'on disait.
Ouais.
Là, toi, tu es là. Tu peux changer les diapos. Est-ce que tu changes les diapos pour tout le monde ou pas?
Je peux.
Parce que moi, il n'y a rien à changer, mais pour Julien, tu peux peut-être suivre.
Oh, bah, après, vu que je parle pas, you can take my.
I will speak from there because I don't need to change any slide. I'm only on the first one. Normally, it's Hello to everyone. Marie Bourgeois, Julien Cooper, and myself are very happy to be there with you to share this moment and this lecture. Thank you very much to be there. And I will start right now this talk called Nomads of the Eastern Sahara, from footnotes to a full page. So, thanks first to the Ifao for giving us the opportunity to have this lecture today and for its support also to the Nomad program. And thanks all of you for attending. Today we will tell you about the state of research about the archaeology and history of nomads in the Eastern Sahara. The emergence of the first archaeologically documented pastoral nomads in the Eastern Sahara dates back nearly 9 millennia in a context of multi-resource exploitation, hunting, fishing, gathering, etc. 1 or 2 millennia before the cultivation of domesticated wheat and barley in the Egyptian Nile Valley. These periods correspond to the so-called African Humid Period, or Green Sahara, which gradually ended between 6,500 and 5,800 years ago. The climate was less arid, surface water sources more numerous, more extensive and more durable, and vegetation cover more developed than today. The pastures and watering places needed to maintain the herd, therefore, had to be more widely distributed, covering large areas that are currently desert. Far from simply suffering from aridification, nomadic pastoralists appear to have contributed directly to the desertification of the Sahara for at least 7,000 years, both through the exploitation of pastures and through soil erosion generated by herd movements. In addition to climatic aridification, there is a second factor contributing to the depletion of water resource and vegetation cover. Them and the Boss Nubian aquifer system have not experienced significant water research for around 7,000 years. So these two aquifers, which cover most of Egypt, in fact, are losing water to the Nile since then, and there is a progressive drawdown of the water in the aquifer for the past 7 millennia. It has probably played an important role in the drying up of the highest water points and the disappearance of some pastures dependent on spring and or on artesian research of the surface aquifer by the Nubian and post-Nubian systems. Despite this combination of natural parameters leading to an ever-increasing desertification in the Eastern Sahara, it seems that nomads have occupied the area continuously up to the present day, both in the desert zone and along the river. However, the composition of the herds has changed over time. Pastoralists initially exploited cattle, sheep and goats, then gradually abandoned in the driest area cattle less suited to desert condition. But cattle have not disappeared, however, but seems to have been concentrated in some areas such as the Nile Valley, the mountain of the Adbai in the Eastern Desert, and the Oasis. The domestication of donkeys around 7,000 years ago, followed by the introduction of camel a little less than 3,000 years ago, probably led to profound and deep change in mobility and resource exploitation and enabled more efficient travel, including travel over long distances. In addition to the archaeological evidence of the presence of nomadic pastoralists for at least 8 millennia in the Eastern Sahara, which mainly concerns the pre- and proto-dynastic periods, probably due to bias in surveys and excavation, in fact, which have focused very little on this population in more recent period, there are numerous attestations in written sources for the last 5 millennia, mainly produced, in fact, not by nomad people, but by sedentary people. Although external and often providing little factual information on nomads, these data at least attest to their continuous presence over the entire period. So, nomadic population have thus occupied the Eastern Sahara for a considerable length of time, and their activity have contributed to the evolution of desert environment on the one hand, and sedentary societies in the Nile Valley on the other, through contact, interaction, and cultural transfer. Studying the occupation and exploitation of the Eastern Sahara, that is to say the whole Eastern Libya, Egypt and Sudan, without studying the nomad, is therefore an obstacle not only to the understanding of nomadic societies and socio-political entities in themselves, but also to apprehending the environmental trajectories of the Sahara and the rhythm of desertification, as well as to elucidating any type of interaction between sedentary and nomadic people in the control and exploitation of desert zones. Throughout the 20th century, however, there still has been very little research specifically on this society, with the exception of work on the prehistory and protohistory of nomadism, for example, Wendorf et al. 2001 and Kinderman et al. 2018, or on more recent period, for example, Murray 1935 or Hobbes 1989, as well as some effort for diachronic synthesis about the eastern desert of Egypt mainly, for example, with books such as Barnard and Wistermat 2012. It seems, in fact, that this delay in research of the nomads of the Eastern Sahara is based on a combination of several distinct factors. First, the nomads of the Eastern Sahara have left very few written sources, so they are mostly described by external sources. Second, their lifestyles and economy, as well as the organization of the sites they occupied, generally produce only tenuous remains, with the notable exception, most of the time, of funerary or ritual sites for some periods, and the long-term imprint on landscape. Third, positivism and evolutionism, particularly during the colonial period, helped shape a Western scientific tradition that viewed nomads as necessarily primitive or irrational, compared with more evolved sedentary people. In this context, nomads were seen as sedentary people in the making, or as population in need for sedentarization. However, far from being merely disorganized savage groups, nomads were able to constitute, at least for some periods, political entities similar to what sedentary people would call kingdoms. They left numerous occupation sites during late antiquity and played a major role in the operation of some Red Sea ports, such as the port of Azab during the Fatimid period. What's more, it is not only a regional or it is only at regional or macro-regional scales that it becomes really possible to grasp nomadic population, as it is at those scales that their exploitation of the environment and the territory was applied. And within the framework also of a multi- and transdisciplinary studies that make it possible to identify all the very tenuous signature of their presence and activity. This raises two additional barriers. The first one is that there is, in Egypt as well as in Sudan and Libya, always logistical and administrative difficulty. If studying a nomadic site already often present difficulties, studying a war region proves to be really complex for a mission or project, for reason of permits on the one hand, and for reason of the necessary resource on the other. The second barrier is that is born from constraints linked to disciplinary boundaries. Understanding, for example, nomadic societies, their evolution and the way in which they exploited the desert implies, in fact, gathering data from a wide range of different disciplines. For all these reasons, nomads have, to quote Julien Cooper in 2020, about the Blemi Beja, nomads have long remained in the footnotes of history. Since the 2010s, research on the nomads of the Eastern Sahara has made great strides through the publication of some books, the development of research on a more regional scale, or dealing with nomads both in the field and through other kind of data, or also at international meetings. While much remains to be done, efficient approaches and methodology have been proposed, and new data are regularly produced. The Nomad program, aims, in fact, to structure and develop research about the nomad of the Eastern Sahara, to bring together researchers from the field of history, archaeology, Egyptology, philology, geography, ecology, and anthropology, to better document and define nomadic societies, their activities and their role in the social environmental trajectories and history of the Eastern Sahara. So it proposed to pool data and method in order to reveal through results from distinct site or region processed by different teams, regional trends or organizations that takes into account the contribution of all the different disciplines. It is thus trying to develop a diachronic transdisciplinary study based on the analysis of different spatio-temporal scale And in order to enable comparison to be made and to take into account the long-term movement of certain nomads, even if the program is focused on Eastern Libya, Egypt and Sudan, we are also in contact with specialists of the Horn of Africa and Arabian Peninsula, for example. With this lecture, we hope to provide you with an overview of the various advances in research on nomadism in different periods. To this end, we will first present some terminological and historiographical elements, then develop case studies and insight into nomadism in various periods. And of course, it will not be possible to be exhaustive, but the objective is to deliver a general vision of the state of research into the history and archaeology of nomadism in Sudan, Egypt, and Eastern Libya.
Hello, everyone. So, okay. So first, we'll have a look a bit about state of art. So about the perception of nomadism first. The term nomad has long been used in a variety of ways, as early as the 1st century AD. For instance, Pliny the Elder evokes a land of nomads, so to know he was talking about Numidia, where the population moved from one grazing area to another, transporting their belongings on carts. It was in a translation by the Greek philosopher Chrysostom Dion that the term nomad first appeared, with the etymology nomas, meaning who pastures, who graze, who make pasture, and ados, who change pasture, who wanders after the manner of flocks. From the 16th century onwards, the word is generally used more widely to designate a person with an itinerant lifestyle, with no fixed dwelling or establishment. To study nomads of the ancient period, the contribution of textual sources can be of great value. However, there are often external sources, as Maël said, so one-sided points of view. Mostly described by sedentary people in context of tension, nomads have long had a bad reputation. Indeed, the term nomad is thus regularly used as a pejorative adjective, with a meaning far removed from its original etymological meaning. From the 18th century onward, whether in novel, classical treatises, ethnographic works, etc., the nomads have a reputation for being lawless, dangerous. They are seen as uncultured, violent. The word nomad is regularly used to designate any type of criminal. This stigmatization persists to this day with the stigmatization of travelers in Europe, for instance, like gypsies. In the 19th century, these groups were categorized as nomads, vagabond, asocial, alloctone, and quickly became synonymous with danger in the collective imagination of sedentary people. This vision of the dangerous nomad, aggressive, unpredictable, and savage, echoes the ancient Egyptian views of their neighbors, for instance. They were often seen and described as primitive, opposed to civilized sedentary people. It's almost always through this dichotomy that nomads are presented. So external textual evidences thus can be precious, but we have to use them with a lot of caution. So what a nomad really is at the end, generally speaking, in archaeology, ethnology, anthropology, the term nomad is used to designate a person, often a member of a community, a group, who has no fixed place of residence and move from one place to another, often in search of water, food, pasture. However, there is no single definition that encompasses all the forms of nomadism that are really numerous, depending on the period, geographical areas, degree of mobility, livelihood strategy, nature of the herd, etc., etc. This reality of being nomadic can vary tremendously. The first studies about nomadism start as early as the 19th century with travelers, geographers that mention subactual and present-day nomadic societies in the Eastern Sahara. They generally describe the Bedouin weather as being good, free, having an ideal way of life that most of the time a geographer and anthropologist want to try as they stay with nomad for a time, or whether they are described as cruel, devious, dangerous people again. However, nomads are almost always compared and opposed to sedentary societies again, since the first work on their groups. They are rarely the focus of subject, mostly archaeological subject of historical preoccupation. The little data we had for a long time has been collected often in a fortuitous way. During the 20th century, we can see the emergence of a great deal of anthropological and ethnological research on nomadism and pastoralism. Also, most of it focused on recent periods. The disciplines of archaeology and ethnology are therefore trying to better understand how sedentary and nomadic society can be linked, work, live together sometimes, by putting the persistent dichotomy, sedentary that are civilized and etc., into perspective. Some discoveries linked to nomadic population can be mentioned in Egypt and Sudan, for instance, but for a long time, questions of nomadism in archaeology have mainly been dealt with on the outskirts of main archaeological sites. It should also be mentioned that research in the Eastern Sahara has long been Nilocentric, so leaving the study of margin deserts and deserts more generally on the side. When the archaeology of nomadism really began to develop, it was for a long time limited to the study of funerary sites, place of worship. So in short, what is the most easily visible, the most visible remains. So settlement, campsites, most of the time, were more difficult to identify, and in addition, they were not being subject of targeted surveys. So for a long time, the earth material culture has been considered as really poor, decomposing over time, leaving no traceable remains. So because we were thinking that, we are not looking for it, because we were thinking that it was impossible to find anyway. Today, the presence of nomadic groups in the Eastern Sahara is widely accepted and attested by archaeology, of course. So we try from the 20th century onward to develop a research of nomadism. But it can be very difficult to document this population through archaeology alone, because the associate remains exist, but they are very discrete, very diffuse. This is one of the reasons for the gap and the delay in the research on nomadism. These difficulties can, however, be compensated by cross-referencing as many sources as possible, drawing on a wide range of disciplines of ethnology, anthropology, philology, history, geography, etc. To better study these communities, archaeology has recently diversified and specialized in the precise processes involved in structuring the economy of nomadic pastoralists, like their social organization, political organization, their interaction, may it be between groups or with the environment. So about the evolution of the disciplines linked to archaeology of nomadism, over the past few years, we know that we had some evolution with, for instance, the archaeology of mobility. The notion of mobility is inherent to nomadism and impacts and is impacted by so many factors that it cannot be properly addressed by archaeology alone. When the archaeology of mobility developed, it did so with the help of ethnography and anthropology and all the studies and concepts linked with. Even within these disciplines, it's only with the most recent research that mobility has begun to be considered as an assembly of phenomena and not as a separate one. It just become a real methodological and theoretical challenge. So the study of mobility focuses on the remains, like sites, material, traces of exploitation, etc., produced during the phase of movement, but also during the phase of stationing, like staying in the camp, as well as all the factors that are impacted and being impacted as temporality, motivation, organization based on different reasons, the way of subsistence, etc. All these factors have been addressed and studied through different disciplines, project and field work during the last decades. by the end of the 20th century already, it was generally accepted that existing archaeological methods were a bit inadequate and that nomadic societies needed to be studied on a wider scale. Surveys and file studies have gradually been extending to desert margin and deserts, so with the work of Maria Carmela Gatto, Julien Cooper, Knut Krasinski, Steven Said-Botham, to quote just a few. The MAVDO also in the Ifao, providing valuable new data for the study of nomadic pastoral societies and everything that can be related to road and desert and mobility. The remains that are most difficult to identify, so campsites, settlements made of non-permanent material, all of that, storage sites, work area, are now the subject of special research and precise studies. The study of nomadism has really developed during the last century, whether through new field methodologies, new projects, new collaborative work or workshop, some colloque, and that's what we are trying to do with the program we are doing with Maël and Julien and Maria and Laurent. Regarding method of analysis, research on nomadism have also begun to diversify with invaluable contribution from discipline as archaeozoology, for example, which is essential to approach the question of herds. Archaeozoology provides information on the age, size, state of health of livestock, seasonality of births, their impact on the seasonal availability of resources, adaptation of species to their environment. Isotope analysis too give the help when isotope analysis of bones enable to reconstruct seasonal migration, the pattern of migration, the feeding habits too, while morphometric analysis tell us more about the origin and lifestyle of livestock too. The development of C14 dates dating, of course, help us to refine chronologies, more easily attribute remains that are sometimes quite difficult to distinguish from one period to another. Another discipline that is of big help is landscape archaeology, the study of environment, climate. Indeed, movement of people can be a response to climatic, environmental, political, social factors. And conversely, the level of mobility of a group can impact identities, technical, artisanal, social practices, political, economical dynamics, exploitation, etc. The elements that circulate within an area or between different areas can be people, but also material, ideas, techniques, etc. So to better approach and understand the nomadic pastoral groups concerned by all this work, it's essential to study their environment in which they evolve. Landscape archaeology is a discipline studying the way in which humans have used, modified, and shaped their environment. So this kind of study can be ethnological, anthropological, social, and can study the landscape as an environment, but also as a cultural, social, political, and economical landscape, with the notion of sacred landscape that can be used sometimes also. So this discipline allows us to address the various environmental and subsistence issues associated with nomadism. We have issues about the access to resources, for instance, their exploitation, domestication and breeding. Do we have enough pasture for herds in certain place? In what way would they were utilized, like in a seasonal way or just few days, few weeks? Environmental and ethnobotanical studies benefit greatly from the contribution of discipline with carpology, palynology, etc. that also provide information on local flora, paleoenvironments of sites, seasonal use, etc. But even if we had a lot of evolution, we need to go further because despite all this progress, the study of nomadism is still struggling to become a field in its own rights, in the Eastern Sahara at least, and remain too marginal to existing field of research. Multidisciplinarity is increasingly favored, but must become systematic, as must transdisciplinarity. Constraints linked to disciplinarity boundaries have played a major part in slowing down research about nomadism, and also exchanges between specialists have become more frequent. There are still too many who are not involved in the discussion as ecologists, geographers, geoarchaeologists, etc. Although these new data and methods represent a major contribution to research on nomadism, we still face some difficulties. The remains, sometimes found in short quantity, are very damaged, do not always allow us to carry out analysis or typological identification. So in the case of sites such as campsites, which leave only a few traces and little or no material at all, it can also be tricky to make a differentiation between ancient nomadic remains and modern nomadic remains. And for the oldest periods, we lack any textual evidence, and as the nomad left a few remains, it can really be hard to draw any conclusion from the available data, in spite of the research led by some mission. But by studying the main documented and published remains as bigger series, it's possible to better understand livelihood and their evolution along time, even if it's still a quite raw vision of nomad and nomadism. The main remains left by nomads that can be found in archaeology for ancient period are mostly campsites, funerary sites, sometimes ritual ceremonial sites, as well as rock art, of course. The following selection of sites I'm going to present is by no way exhaustive. I'll focus mainly on Egypt and Sudan, both Nile Valley and the desert. And I will show you some selected sites to give you an idea of the kind of nomadic remains and sites that exist. So as soon as the 6th millennium BC, we can find settlement, funerary, ritual sites already. For campsites, it does usually respond to seasonal variation and are occupied for a relatively short period, like several weeks or months. Sometimes repeated over time. This kind of remain generally leaves very little trace in the landscape and is not always easy to locate during prospecting. Some have been found and studied for periods as far back as the late Neolithic in Egypt, for example, so around the end of the 6th millennium BC. So the example you have on the left of the screen is in Nabta Playa, in the desert. It's a camp made up of a dozen of earth fireplaces, some pits and huts. It was barely visible in the landscape as no structures has been built. It was only after surface stripping that traces of occupation, so the post hole, the earth, etc., become apparent. Only one hut was excavated, and it's often the problem, like it's rarely excavated on the wall. And this hut was fairly symptomatic of the lack of it's symptomatic of the lack of interest in this type of vestige, and the little time devoted to it. Regarding the stratigraphy of the site, the camp would have been seasonal, and the material consists of ceramic and lithic tools, as well as some bovine bones, subjecting a pastoral lifestyle for the local population. On the same site, Nabta Playa, there were a small cluster of tumuli that has been attributed to nomadic population. In the Eastern Sahara, some funerary sites start to be linked to livestock that play a major role in the nomad's life, as far from the 6th millennium BC. Among the different small tumuli in Nabta Playa, one grave contained human remains, while some of these structures could potentially be more symbolic than funerary, with only few cattle bones scattered among the stone. And one that is in the middle of the screen contains complete cattle. And this grave is a proof of the big importance of livestock for pastoral population. Regarding ritual or ceremonial sites, they can be difficult to identify because they are often located close to burial or settlement site, but it's quite hard to assert that it can be something intentional. Most of the time, at this period, it's megalithic or lithic installation on large or small scale, it depends. The one on the right of the screen was spotted by a team after several times on the field, because at the beginning they saw that it wasn't an intentional installation. It consists of various alignment of natural or roughly retouched stone blocks, which were originally intended to be erected, and which, despite being broken up today, still mark the landscape in a noticeable way. Still in Napta Playa, the same site can be seen some ritual sites consisting of piles of stone under which pits have been dug, but we don't really know the original use of those sites. But their nomadic origin is assumed due to their proximity to the nomadic camp of Napta Playa, that is nomadic. During the 5th millennium, campsite can still be found, the same kind of settlement. So we have you have an example on the left that show you how difficult it can be to spot it, that kind of site, because we have nearly no remains. This one date of the very beginning of the 5th millennium, pretty similar to the previous one, to know some huge floor marked by the presence of post hole, some earths and depression, probably trash pits. Ceramic material was found scattered on the floor, on the sad surface, and most of the time it's because we can see some material scattered on the surface that we can know that we have a campsite that are really difficult because to spot, because we don't have any structure. Or sometimes we can also see some depression in the sand. Regarding funerary sites, the tumuli kind of site spread rapidly from the Eastern Sahara westward to the Nile Valley. These structures became characteristic of desert funerary culture and were used for millennia. The one that I show you today is in the eastern desert of Egypt. It's called Wadi Rashab. It's a circular enclosure with a main burial surrounded by cow, sheep, and goat burial, pointing in direction of the main burial. So probably someone important within a pastoral group, pastoral population. This site is an evidence for the presence of cattle keepers in the eastern desert as soon as the 5th millennium. Tumuli can also be found in the desert of Nubia, with, for instance, the Wadi al-Lawi tumuli. It was excavated by the Aswo Komombo expedition. This tumulus is around 7 meters in diameter and consists of 2 circles of stone that lay directly on the sand and on a layer of crushed rock. An upright stone stand at the center of the structure was found and could be a pontoon stelae. This structure covers a single burial pit, but has been looted, unfortunately. We can also have ritual sites, even if they are more rare than the other kind of sites. So the one on the right was in Wadi Rashab, so next to the tumuli I showed you just before. The tumuli was part of a complex, so surrounded by different stelae. Those stones are on the ground, but they were erected before, presumably. They can go up to 2 meters high. And they were in satellite position around the enclosure, without any visible clear organization, but still around. They were supported by smaller stone, we can see all around, to stay upright at the origin. But it's unfortunately impossible to date the erection of this stelae. It could be contemporaneous of the site, but maybe later, if the site has been visited for a long time. Maybe as kind of a place of memory. And without any precise datation, it's really hard to go further on the hypothesis about ritual and ceremonial place for nomad, unfortunately. For the 4th millennium BC, We still have campsites, of course, but we have also a different kind of site as shelter. When a nomadic group, or at least part of a group, had to regularly travel varying distances with a herd to find grazing area, they might sometimes occupy rock shelters instead of camps. Regarding the variety of material found inside this shelter that was found in Lower Nubia, in Salaya, it was very difficult to say if it was occupied on a long time or not, but what is sure, and that it was occupied short time until the 2nd millennium BC, from the 4th to the 2nd millennium BC. A fireplace was set up just in front of the shelter and was protected at the origin by a low wall of dry stone. It's facing northeast, so they must have been relatively cool in summer, protected from the sun, while in winter they were exposed to southerly winds, so a bit warmer. We still have, of course, campsites. This one was found at Maris Marcos. This site is another perfect example of the lack of data we had for a long period of time regarding campsite archaeology. As this site was not excavated in its entirety and excavation was probably concentrated on the upper occupation layer, it's difficult to make any assumption about the actual occupation time of the camp. Was it a very brief period of time or longer? A very brief period of time has been assumed here, but only because they focus on a very thin layer. And the frequency of the occupation, would they come back or not? It's also a difficult subject to work on because of the lack of data. The remains consist of few fireplaces and abundant material only. Most of the time, it's thanks to the scattered material that the site is identified, and that was the case here. And also, mostly, it was visible because of the thanks to the small sand mounds resulting of looting. Regarding funerary sites, at this period, they can either be tumuli, more or less isolated, or more classic cemeteries composed of varied number of graves, most of the time not of very big size, cover marked by stone mound or not. For instance, we have this cemetery of Tunkala West in Lower Nubia, linked to the A group, Nubian A group. The graves in this cemetery have some heritage of the tumular desertic tradition because of the stone that may covered up the surface of the grave before. The features are quite round or oval with a stone superstructure. We can see also kind of stelae, maybe, offering place that were installed just in front of the tomb. For the 3rd millennium, we still have campsites. That's in majority what we have anyway. This Nubian site is stratigraphically marked by a series of ephemeral occupation sequences going from the end of the 1st to the 3rd millennium BC. The location of huts are marked by post hole, small floor installation, and remnants of compacted earth floor. Some fireplaces are also present. And on the surface, dense concentration of material can be noted. We have pottery, we have flaked stone, ground stone, burnt animal bones, even cattle skull in some part of the site. Mollusk shell also, medium to large stone, some fire affected. Regarding funerary sites, we still can have either cemeteries, more classic, or tumuli, more linked to desertic tradition. Nubian links to the first half of the 3rd millennium BC are not well known, but they seem that they came back to a more nomadic way of life under Egyptian pressure, among other reasons, either in the Nile Valley, oasis, or in the desert. The cemetery of Hermont is in the Nile Valley in Upper Egypt. and seems to be linked to Nubian of the third millennium, even if it's in Egypt. This cemetery is composed of clusters of cattle, ox graves that are organized around a main grave, a main human grave. So as we saw for the tumuli of the 5th millennium, the desertic tradition, cattle tradition. It may have been a kind of funerary accompaniment, some sacrifice accompaniment for someone important, maybe a pastoral chief, something like that. Still in the desert, some tumuli seems to me linked to nomadic pastoral tradition. With those graves, that seems organized, it's less clear here, but maybe organized around a main element. This one was found with cow bones, also in grave. So maybe this kind of very important cattle tradition linked to pastoral chief, pastoral groups that were wandering in the desert. The other center of nomadic activity in the 3rd millennium BC are the oases, which were the home to a nomadic or agro-pastoralist group called the Sher Muftar, after the sites which they were found. Careful excavation at the site of Balat by Clara Yotte, among others, and El Karafish by Rimmer, demonstrate a nomadic group that extended from the oasis to the adjacent desert plateau, especially after winter rains. With the arrival of the Egyptians to the oasis in the Old Kingdom, this nomadic horizon seems to have vanished or perhaps integrated into the norms of Egyptian life. I let the floor to Julien for the rest.
Thank you, Marie, and thank you, everyone. I'll continue this chronicle in the 2nd millennium BCE. Nomadic archaeological sites in this period are not well studied, and this correlates to the Pharaonic period from the Middle Kingdom to the New Kingdom 18th and 19th dynasties. And there is significant debate as to what constitutes a nomadic site when most of the sites that we associate with nomads in the literature, like the Pangrave Horizon, are actually found in areas close to the Nile Valley, in which case they are predominantly in agricultural zones. The same goes to a great extent for the low fertility areas of the Nubian Nile, especially Lower Nubia, where a marked characteristic of 2nd millennium BC Nubian sites is the balance mix of herding and farming together. This might be partly due to contraction of nomadic lands from drying conditions at the end of the African Humid Period. The most well-known sites are actually related to pastoralist occupations right on the valley itself. The most strange and enigmatic of these, as I said, are the Pangrave, a culture named after these so-called pan-shaped graves that appear at various points in Upper Egypt, Lower Nubia, and even in Middle Egypt. This culture has often been argued to be a nomadic intrusion of Egypt, nomads on the Nile, perhaps originating from the Eastern Desert or elsewhere. Like other Nubian groups, the Pangrave people adorn their burials with cattle skulls, and thus display a specific pastoral tradition separating them from ordinary life of the Egyptians. Elsewhere, desert sites are quite well known in various spaces, from the Handesi Horizon in western Nubia to sites on the Libyan coast associated with the Bronze Age Libyans. But most of these sites are only excavated to a point to understand where nomads were from the point of artifact scatters or rock art, and only rarely has a camp been excavated comprehensively. One interesting case study, and this is the one pictured here, is the site of Tel El Borg on the Eastern Delta, a site connected with an Egyptian fortress which otherwise had an extensive series of stick fences beyond the fortress confines. These were interpreted by the excavators, Hofmeyr and Davis, as evidence of a camp of the Shasu, that is, the nomads who occupied the Sinai and adjacent regions. In this case, the Shasu would have been living either within or around a pre-existing Egyptian community that existed on this border fortress. And this is a well-known historical case study, for example, in the Wars of Seti I, where we can see the interactions of nomads and the Egyptian state at one site. The first millennium BCE is perhaps more mysterious than the previous millennia in terms of nomadic occupations, at least in the archaeological record. The textual record of Pharaonic Egypt and later Ptolemaic Egypt tell of extensive interactions with nomads. Indeed, the Libyans of nomadic heritage became the rulers of Egypt for multiple dynasties in this period. The Kushites to the south in Sudan and Nubia likewise warred with nomadic groups to their east and west, as is recorded in their annals, such as the Annals of Hasi-Yotef and the Annals of Anlamani. The nomads were living in many Egyptian towns from Lower Egypt to Upper Egypt, and Greek historians like Agaphakites painted rich pictures of nomadic lives in the desert. But all this rich textual heritage is not mirrored plentifully in the archaeological record. Nomadic sites in this period are known from several places on the Libyan coast, the Bayuda and Butana deserts in Sudan, but there are very few well-excavated or documented nomadic sites from this period, at least in comparison to previous periods before it. The first millennium BCE marks a watershed moment in the history of deserts and nomads in Northeast Africa and Greater Africa, I would argue. It is at some point in this period that the camel, the dromedary, first arrives. While there are some early dates for camels on trade routes, what we are actually looking for here with respect to nomads is the adoption of breeding populations of camels. A recently published ostracon from a Ptolemaic fortress might tell just how this happened when it is explained that an Arab nomad in the desert had brought a breeding female camel next to a fortress site and well site. It cannot have been long after this that local nomadic groups had adopted camels, possibly through these Arabs and trade routes, and inserted them and integrated them into their herds, something that would change nomads forever by giving them a new beast of burden, a new source of milk and meat, and a new weapon of war. During the first millennium BCE, there seems to be increasing nomadic populations in Egypt and Sudan, which is also marked by a wide expansion of Blemian territory into the north in the Nile Valley and also in the Red Sea ports. For example, the Polish-American mission at Berenica discovered evidence of increased nomadic presence during the late Roman period. But these dynamics are more visible through textual evidence, as most of the known archaeological remains have not been documented thoroughly. Surveys in Eastern Sudan have revealed extensive cemeteries and large nomadic camps, much larger than most nomadic camps in desert environments in previous periods and indeed periods after. The site of Khor Nukt stands out as an exceptional example of the concentration of nomads in the desert. This site was likely the capital of the Blemis in the first millennium CE. There was a cemetery of almost 1,500 tumuli and a large town which possessed one of the earliest mosques in Sudan, as well as numerous domestic dwellings surrounding this. Nomads, coming out of this evidence, could form powerful confederations and capitals far away from the Nile. A similar nomadic explosion is observed in the deserts to the west of Nubia, in the region of Kordofan. At Jebel Zankor, a massive site on the side of a hill was identified by a French mission, probably the centre of an agro-pastoralist polity controlling the deserts west of the Nile in Wadi el-Malik and Wadi Muqaddam, an almost mirror image of the eastern deserts of Sudan. Elsewhere, nomadic camps have been identified in the coastal regions of the Mediterranean, throughout the Sinai Peninsula, with Roman-era papyri documenting nomads in almost every major city in Upper and Lower Egypt. For the second millennium AD, there is almost no well-studied and comprehensively studied archaeological data, but much more, as everyone would expect, textual evidence as we go on in history. The ancient Egyptian and Kushite states portrayed an explicitly negative view of nomads in their literature, but this was partly guided by ideological purposes rather than a set reality. The teachings of King Merikare of the Middle Kingdom show massive negativity to the Asiatic Amu nomads, the nomads of the Sinai, telling the reader they are miserable because of the place where they live, their lands having a short of water, lack of many trees, with nomads being plagued by want. It was miserable all around. A text from the Temple of Esna, on the other hand, mentions that when the god Khnum created the world, he gave the nomads of the Eastern Desert only the most basic of foodstuffs, meaning that Egyptians were associated with plenty and nomads with destitution. Likely for urban dwellers on the Nile, nomadic life appeared to be particularly negative, frequent with movement, living in harsh environment, exposed to nature, and seemingly full of risk. For nomads, however, this was hardly the case, and their systems of herding and agropastoralism allowed for significant risk mitigation and flexibility, or even profit. They could, after all, move, thus being highly flexible. Outside of this type of literature, the stereotyping view of nomads extends to the artistic record, which generally depicts nomads, like all possible enemies of Egypt and Kush, as subjugated and disorganized masses. From the Libyans to the Shasu of the Sinai, nomads lived a non-Egyptian life. Our view of nomads becomes much better in late antiquity and the medieval period, and this might be partly attributed to the arrival of the camel and a demographic explosion of desert nomads as a result of this new ruminant. It appears quite clearly in the textual sources that during late antique and medieval times, nomads were involved in trade through road control, camel renting and port management, for example at Aidab or the road to Qusr al-Qadim, and this remains true going on in time until the Ottoman period and almost the present day. In general, nomadic drylands in Northeast Africa were not home to literate traditions, a stark contrast to Arabia, where various nomadic groups adopted short-form inscriptions, such as the speakers of Safavidic or early Arabic. Mainly, oral communication was perfectly functional for all necessary purposes, and memorialization of events and mythology was engaged through oral folklore and associated traditions, something which continues until the present day. There are exceptions to this rule, however. The Libyans much further to the west adopted a script known as the Tifinagh or Proto-Berber script. Perhaps most fantastically are the cases where the Blemmyes use Greek and Coptic, and at least in one occasion, Meroitic script, to write documents pertaining to their own nomadic administration. The context for Blemmian writing comes with the height of their power in the 3rd to 6th centuries CE, where they had seized parts of the Nile River from Lower Nubia and also the area around Moala and Gebeline in Upper Egypt, possibly also taking control of the port of Berenica for a period. In Lower Nubia, they used Greek in a diplomatic document, the so-called Letter of Phonon, showing extensive apparatus as a power and the fact that their administration possessed their own scribes, dedicated officials. The documentation from Gebeline, which you can see here, it's a gazelle skin papyri, reveals a fully functional and legal and economic administration that collected taxes, issued edicts, and managed daily life of the Blemmies. The Blemmian conquest of urban areas had necessitated the use of this written medium. In one document, the Blemmian king Karaken, which is the document you see here, gives the administration of an island to his children, signing his name in the document with a Wassam camel brands, the same tradition used today in the deserts of Egypt and Sudan and Arabia. We even know the names of these Blemmian scribes and translators. Dioscoros, and at Berenica, the translator for the Blemmies is given the name Mokosak. In yet another document, a Christian text is written in the Coptic script, but not recording Coptic. Rather, it was the only document that records the indigenous Beja language. These examples show that when nomads reach power, they could adopt textual traditions of their urban neighbours. Other nomads from further abroad may be added to this corpus. Nabatean and Palmyran traders made inscriptions in the eastern desert, as did the late antique nomads of the Sinai Peninsula. Nomads use landscape horizontally, travelling and grazing over extremely wide areas as part of daily life. Any study on nomadic context, therefore, must take landscape as its primary focus of study, especially linking salient features in the natural environment with nodes of human habitation, as you can witness in this remote sensing map of the Atbai Survey project, linking wells and tumuli and settlement features. As part of this program studying the nomads of Eastern Sudan and addressing the heritage concerns of destruction to the local archaeological record, the Atbai Survey project at Macquarie University established this program of remote sensing in order to document heritage in this very underrepresented region of Eastern Sudan, the Atbai. In the first year of this project, approximately 140,000 structures have been documented, from nomadic camps, burial sites, gold mines of different ages, Neolithic structures, and also environmental data such as wells, passes, and roads. The intention is to make a record of the region's heritage as quickly as possible before many of these sites are destroyed by gold mining. This data can also be used to fill the extraordinarily large gaps in our human habitation and chronologies of this desert, from nomads in the pastoral Neolithic to Bronze Age Medjay sites to late antique and medieval Blemies, and also gold mines of the pharaohs and the gold mines of the Abbasids. This data is then given to Sudanese authorities, a project relating to endangered African archaeology in Cambridge University called MEASAM, as well as local custodians, to create a first map of the heritage of the region. The follow-up surveys and projects would aim to further document and protect these sites of notable value so that the region's heritage can be celebrated for its cultural and scientific value. There are numerous ways nomadic studies can proceed into the future. More excavations and surveys, more anthropological studies and ethnographies, greater synthesis, landscape and environmental projects, or perhaps best of all, a combination of these methods. In fact, this is what is generally required in nomadic studies, a holistic utilization of all possible available fields to create a unique whole. From our research in this program, it seems that nomadic complexity across the Nile Basin is much greater than was previously assumed. Researchers are constantly identifying new nomadic political institutions and even kingdoms, making it likely that there were many more nomadic powers in the region than otherwise assumed in our classical literature. All these nomads, whether in the desert or closer to the Nile, felt the influence of Egypt and Nubia. Through trade, the imperialism of Nile kingdoms, or seasonal migration to the Nile itself for grazing or employment, nomads were never separated from the lives of Egyptians and Sudanese. In particular, nomads themselves made Egyptian and Nubian lives functional through cooperation on desert roads and mining initiatives. The Berenika Road would not have functioned properly without supply and logistics from nomads, and Egyptian gold mining parties needed nomads for protection and reading the landscape. Perhaps more mysteriously for our current methods, we need to understand how nomads changed the environment and how they themselves adapted to their new environments. Nomads could change their domesticates, the sizes of their herds, the number of members for the travelling family or tribe, and even choose to settle in more fertile regions. The relationship of nomad to environment is complex and recursive. The environment changed nomads, but they also changed it. Part of a raging debate in geography and ecology on the sustainability of drylands nomadism. Sometimes nomads even farmed in their desert, an allure of creating a crop like their brothers and sisters on the Nile Valley. What we say is that all these nomads were skillful readers of the landscape, constantly making complex decisions on movement and herding, balancing the needs of herding life, family, tribe, resources, and sovereignty on a daily basis. This research raises new questions on nomads and nomads' role in the engine of ancient regimes in Northeast Africa. How influential were nomads for spreading ideas across desert routes and corridors of migration? How did nomads shape macro-historical events like the adoption of new domesticates, the formation of new regimes like the Libyan dynasties, the Hyksos, or post-Meroitic Nubia, or take part in wars as mercenaries of state actors? From the Old Kingdom trading expeditions to Nubia, to the Arab invasion of Egypt, to Napoleon's campaigns, nomads formed a key part of the power politics of Egypt and Sudan. Underlying this all was humble movement with tents and herds. The traditions of these people in the ancient past is barely understood, yet with an eye to the lives of modern nomads across the region, we may develop persuasive models, hypotheses, and bring ancient nomads to life. Thank you everyone for your attention.
And so we have some time for some question, if anybody of you want to ask some questions.
Thank you so much for those two fantastic lectures. And I have two questions about Maria, the first researcher. Can we consider these forms or structures of those nomadic groups during from 6th to 3rd millennia BC? Can we consider those structures of patterns of life as transitory and temporary structures during the historical period, these transitory periods that in most historical civilization experience, or we can notice or recognize some patterns that are exclusive for them and exclusive for the nomadic people that survive the historical record and continue to live after the discovery of writing and the establishment of agricultural civilization. And I ask about the, was there any form of pictography on the artifacts discovered from this period? And I have two questions about the second lecture. Thank you so much. The first one, you mentioned that there was proliferation of nomadic people in Egypt during the Ptolemaic dynasty. Was there any relation between this proliferation of nomadic groups during Ptolemaic Egypt and the breaking out of revolutions in the second half of Ptolemaic dynasty, especially in Upper Egypt and Thebes region? And you mentioned that there was also vigorous growing of nomadic people from the 3rd to 6th centuries AD. I ask about their attitudes towards Christianity. And the last question, something astonishing to me, and I learned so much that those nomadic people are experts about weather phenomena. Can we determine any phenomena or climatic changes from the archaeological records? And thank you so much.
Thank you.
So thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your question. So if I understood well, you want to know if some nomadic patterns can be seen within later nomadic or within sedentary group, within other nomadic population. We can see, for instance, that the desertic tradition of tumuli has a long, it's a long, very long tradition and has been, you know, let's say used by many other nomadic groups. For instance, even if it's not a tumuli, but a group of tombs, they still covered the tomb with stone mounds or circle the tomb with stone. It's a way to, let's say, make survive some kind of tradition, nomadic tradition. Sometimes some place too, like tumuli, can be a place of pilgrimage a bit, because it stays important. Even if people are moving from place to other, even if they change their way of life, they attach importance to some very old tradition linked to nomadic population. And you had another second question? The motifs on the ceramics, for example, or things like that. Yeah, of course, you have some tradition, some influences. Of course, we have some evolution, some changes, but some quite basic pattern on ceramic, like crisscross or herringbones for Nubian ceramics, for instance. I'm not a specialist of, you know, of the kind of ceramics, but can be seen for, yeah, rock art too, with, yeah, Maya is right, rock art too. You have depiction of herds with cattle, and sometimes it's so hard to date those representations because it's kind of always the same, even if, of course, typology can change, and that's the only way we have to difference the a bit as we can the representation. But yeah, I think tradition is very persistent within the nomadic Nubian desertic population. Thank you.
If I understood well, you had also a question about maybe that it was a transitory state. For this part, I don't think we can think like that. We think like that because of evolutionism way of thinking, evolutionist way of thinking. So we think that first we are nomad, and then we settle, and then we are never nomad again. But what we see for the long durée perspective on nomad history and prehistory is that, in fact, you have nomads that stays nomad. You have nomads that become sedentary people. You have sedentary people that become nomads or become nomads again. So it's much more complicated. And from the same population that Marie speak about, for example, maybe some went into the Nile Valley and start something new, keeping tradition, but some others went to the source in other part of the desert, and some others stood there. So it's very complicated, and I think we still lack data on more bigger area, as Marie told us during our talk.
Thanks. I wrote down your questions, so I hope I remember them in order. The first one was on Ptolemaic nomads. I think that question is, I think the answer I can give there is in the Ptolemaic period, we have so many more documentary texts and papyri and letters than we do in previous periods. So we suddenly see nomads in cities in Egypt where they were always living, but now we see them in greater resolution and clarity in both the Ptolemaic and Roman period because we have so many administrative documents, also in the desert, and we have an expert, Laura, here, who can answer that or tell me if I'm wrong. So it's not so much anything has changed, we just see them better. For the second question on the 3rd to 6th century attitudes to Christianity, we know some of those edicts I showed you, the Blemies some of them were Christian, and they have two names. They have a Blemian name and a Christian name. So some, but not all, of the Blemian tribes adopted Christianity. We know that because when Ibn Khaldun or Yaqubi and all the Arab geographers talk about Eastern Sudan and Blemies, they also mention that they followed an indigenous religion, and some of them converted to Islam from an indigenous religion rather than Christianity. Your other question was regarding weather phenomenon, and I'm not going to answer this very scientifically, but I would just say every nomad I've spoken to and lived amongst have an incredibly encyclopedic knowledge of their environment, which includes the weather. And that's partially related to their functionality in the desert. They need to be able to assess when rain is likely to fall, where there's more vegetation. They always have a very good knowledge of the seasons, sometimes even have stories associated with the coming and going of seasons. And I think that's an essential part of the practical means of nomadic life. They can't not have that knowledge. And I think the last question was climate, based on whether we can assess climate differences, and I think Maël is better for that.
Thank you. So regarding the climate change, in fact, what we really know for now is that we have a more humid period until 7 millennia ago. Something that changed at this time or later. I think it's 7 millennia ago. Some other specialists think it's 5 millennia ago. But in fact, as it moved gradually from north to south, following the retreat of the East African monsoon rainfall, the main idea is to keep in mind is that it's gradual and it's mid-Holocene until, let's say, beginning of late Holocene. It stopped in the 3rd millennium BC or earlier. After that, we have some very light climate fluctuation, not strong one. We have something during the Roman period, probably in Sudan. Some researchers think also we have the same in Egypt, but it seems to be something else that happened in Egypt, probably too much agricultural development in the 2nd century AD, and then kind of agricultural crisis linked probably with salinity and with probably depopulation of some of the rural areas. But yeah, for first millennium AD, we are quite sure that this demographic boom cannot be linked with climate. It's something else. It's something that also happened in the Arabian Peninsula. It's really difficult to understand why. All that we can say today is that it happened, and the nomads spread outside the desert more than in the few centuries before, with the raid in Coptos, for example, and the occupation of Coptos and this kind of event. They went also more to the north for the Blemis, but we cannot really understand why right now. It's one of the questions we tried to address yesterday during the workshop, for example. Yes.
Okay, so hi, wonderful lecture. So I am particularly interested in storage facilities and also adapting spaces into dwellings. So I was actually going to ask you about this picture. Did you look inside? Did you talk to the people who were using it?
Okay, so yeah, we saw it first in, it was 3 years ago during the MAVDO field session. And we go there every year since then to have lunch on Friday because it's a wonderful place. Of course, we are speaking with the people there. It's one of the storage rooms, but the problem is that it's closed. And we were never there at the same time as the owners, the family that owns it. But I looked inside, of course. I used my camera, and the problem is that it's cleaned. They clean it. And you even have, there you can see that it's something they have taken from inside and put outside. There are still some tools, present-day tools, iron tools inside. In the rocks, not far, they also have hidden bigger tools for cultivation, this kind of thing. But it's completely impossible to date this kind of structure because it's just a natural block that is there. Someone say, oh, that's a nice place if I dig there. So he digs there, he starts to use it as hut or storage room, and it's used again and again and again and rebuilt. There is traces of kind of mix between mud and small vegetation, shredded part of vegetable or vegetation on the wall, several states of it, but still we can't say anything, and it's exactly what Marie told us during her part of the lecture. Sometimes it's really hard to be sure if what we are seeing is ancient or if what we are seeing is 1960, and most of the time it's both. For example, we have another camp, a kind of shelter, but less deep than the one Marie showed you. In the same place, we have remains from the 1980s, and we have a Bedouin guy that told Darcy Ackley, one of our colleagues of the mission, okay, my grandfather used to come there. And in the same place, we have Ptolemaic grinding stone for gold and potsherd from different times. And we don't even know if it's because people come there or because the grandfather of our informant just took there and took it back, took it there because he found it nice or funny. So in this kind of situation, it's a bit complicated. Is there any? Yeah.
Thank you all for your wonderful presentation. My question is for Marie. Maybe it's a little bit naive question regarding the stele that you were talking about from different sites, belong to the 5th and 4th millennium. I'm a little bit not understanding or not sure if they were inscribed. I don't think so. But if they don't inscribe, then what do you call them stele? There is different stele. And also there is another one from the 5th millennium.
If a pride stone, but a way to mark a place of importance, mark a place for offering, things like that, to remember the memory of someone, maybe. So we call that stelae because we have to name it, and maybe this word is used. I never question the why we are using this word. I'm just, I continue to use it, saying stelae. Maybe it's because we make parallel, like, with the modern and later stelae, like a way of remembering someone, putting something upright to mark a place, to mark something important. But no inscription, nothing. Unfortunately. Yeah.
Any more question? No? So thank you very much for everybody in the room and